The city square was wide and open and filled with soft morning light, and people walked slowly across the stone ground while taking photos and talking quietly, and the tall iron gates of the royal grounds stood firm and silent behind them. At the center of the gate stood a royal guard named Leo, and he was dressed in a neat uniform, and his posture was straight and strong, and his face showed no emotion at all. Leo had been trained for years to stand without moving, and to remain calm no matter what happened around him, and silence was part of his duty, and respect was part of his nature. Leo came from a small town where life was simple and values were clear, and his father had taught him that strength was not shown through anger but through control. As a child, Leo watched people argue and fight, but he learned early that patience could stop many problems before they started. That lesson stayed with him as he grew older and chose a life of service where discipline mattered more than pride. The square slowly became more crowded as visitors arrived from different places, and some admired the guards while others barely noticed them. Children pointed at the shiny buttons on the uniforms, and parents pulled them closer to keep order, and cameras flashed as tourists captured memories. Through all of it, Leo remained still and focused, and his eyes stayed forward as if nothing else existed. Among the crowd was a woman named Karen, and she walked with fast steps and sharp movements, and her face showed clear frustration. She had arrived late, and wanted to enter the royal grounds without waiting, and patience was not something she carried with her that day. Her eyes landed on the guards, and instead of seeing rules and duty, she saw barriers standing in her way. Karen pushed forward and reached the front of the gate, and raised her voice demanding to be allowed inside. Signs nearby clearly stated that entry was restricted, but she did not look at them and chose to ignore what did not suit her. People around her glanced over, and some stepped aside to avoid being involved. Leo heard her voice but did not turn his head, and did not speak, and did not react. His training told him that silence was required, and his duty was to stand firm no matter what words were thrown at him. Karen noticed his lack of response, and her frustration grew stronger with each passing moment. She moved closer, and spoke louder, and waved her hand near his face, hoping to force a reaction. Still Leo remained motionless and calm, and his silence felt like a wall she could not break. The crowd began to watch more closely, and quiet murmurs spread through the square. Karen felt embarrassed and angry at the same time, and she believed the guard was ignoring her on purpose. Her voice rose higher and sharper, and her words became more aggressive as she demanded attention. Some people shook their heads while others lifted their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Leo stood firm and steady, and inside his mind he repeated the rules he had memorized years ago. He reminded himself that one moment of anger could ruin everything he had worked for. His breathing stayed slow and controlled as the tension around him increased. Karen stepped even closer and stood directly in front of him, blocking his view of the square. She stared at his face, searching for any sign of reaction, but found none. That silence made her feel powerless, and she reacted in the worst way possible. Without thinking, she lifted her hand and struck his shoulder in anger, believing he would remain silent and still. A sharp gasp moved through the crowd, and the square fell into sudden quiet. Time seemed to slow as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Leo did not move, and did not speak, and did not change his expression. His calm response was more powerful than any shout or argument. Karen stepped back slightly as reality began to sink in. People around her stared with wide eyes and disbelief, and some whispered while others stood frozen. The air felt heavy and tense, and even the sounds of the city seemed to fade. Karen suddenly realized that many eyes were on her, and that cameras were recording everything. What she did not know was that this moment had already been noticed by more than just the crowd. Hidden cameras and nearby officials had seen everything clearly. This single action was about to lead to consequences she never expected. Leo remained standing as he always had, and his silence carried a quiet strength that filled the space. The crowd waited, and Karen felt fear replace her anger. Something bigger was coming, and no one there would forget what happened next. The silence after the strike felt longer than it really was, and the crowd stayed frozen, as if time itself had stopped for a moment. Leo continued to stand still with his eyes forward, and his posture unchanged, and the calm on his face made the moment feel even heavier. Karen looked around and noticed the shocked faces and the phones raised in the air, and her heart began to beat faster. A few people whispered quietly while others shook their heads in disbelief, and no one stepped forward to defend her actions. The square that once felt open and busy now felt tight and uncomfortable, and every sound seemed louder than before. Karen tried to speak, but her words came out uneven and unsure as she realized the situation was no longer under her control. From inside the gate, two senior officers approached with steady steps, and their faces were serious and focused. They had seen everything through security cameras and through reports from nearby staff. Their presence alone made the crowd step back and clear a path. Leo noticed them from the corner of his vision, but did not turn his head or move his body. He remained in position as trained and trusted that the system would now take over. The officers stopped beside him and briefly checked his condition without drawing attention. One officer then turned to Karen and calmly asked her to step away from the gate. His voice was firm but respectful, and it carried authority that could not be ignored. Karen tried to explain herself, but her words sounded weak and rushed. She claimed she was frustrated and felt ignored and did not mean any harm. The officer listened without interrupting, and his calm made her feel smaller with each sentence. The crowd listened closely, and some recorded every word. Another officer explained that touching a royal guard was a serious offense regardless of intent. He spoke slowly so everyone could understand, and there was no anger in his tone. Karen's face lost color as she realized the weight of her actions. She looked again at Leo, hoping for some reaction or mercy, but he remained silent and still. That silence made her feel more uneasy than any argument could have. For the first time she understood that his calm was not weakness but strength. The officers asked for her identification and guided her away from the gate. She walked slowly, and her confidence from earlier was completely gone. The crowd parted and watched her pass in silence. As she moved away, people whispered about respect and discipline and consequences. Some shook their heads while others looked thoughtful and reflective. The moment had become more than just an argument in a square. Leo continued to stand at his post as if nothing had happened. Inside his mind, he felt the rush of emotion begin to settle. He reminded himself that staying calm had protected him and preserved his duty. A young boy in the crowd looked at Leo with wide eyes full of admiration. The boy tugged at his parent's hand and whispered something quietly. That small moment reminded Leo why his role mattered beyond rules. The officers returned to their positions and the square slowly began to breathe again. Tourists lowered their phones and conversations restarted in softer tones. But the feeling of the moment stayed heavy in the air. Karen was taken to a nearby office where officials explained the situation clearly. They spoke about respect and responsibility and the importance of behavior in public spaces. She listened quietly and nodded as the reality settled in. She thought about her actions and how quickly anger had taken control. For the first time she saw how her behavior looked from the outside. Shame replaced her earlier frustration, and her eyes filled with regret. Back at the gate, Leo was finally allowed a short break. He stepped aside briefly and took a deep breath away from the crowd. Another guard replaced him while he gathered himself. A senior officer approached Leo and quietly praised his professionalism. The words were simple but meaningful, and Leo felt a sense of pride. He knew he had honored his training and his values. When Leo returned to his position, the crowd noticed the smooth transition. Some people nodded respectfully as they passed by. The atmosphere had shifted from shock to reflection. Karen remained in the office thinking about the moment again and again. She realized that silence had spoken louder than her anger ever could. That understanding stayed with her as officials finished their process. What Karen did not yet know was that the incident had already spread beyond the square. Videos were being shared and discussions were beginning online and in offices. The story was no longer just about her anger but about the power of calm. Leo stood once more at the gate, steady and silent. The sun shifted slightly in the sky and shadows moved across the stone ground. The day continued, but the lesson had already been learned. Something even bigger was about to follow, and it would bring consequences and change that no one expected. The day moved forward, but the moment at the gate continued to echo in many minds across the city. People who had been in the square talked about what they saw and shared their thoughts with others. The story spread not because of anger but because of the calm response that surprised everyone. Leo returned to his post after the short break and stood again with the same steady posture. His face remained calm, and his eyes stayed forward as if nothing had changed. Inside him, however, the moment stayed alive as a reminder of why control mattered. Visitors continued to arrive and leave, and many looked at Leo with new respect. Some slowed their steps as they passed, and others whispered quietly to companions. The guard who had been silent now carried a strong presence without saying a word. In a nearby building, officials reviewed recordings of the incident carefully. They watched the moment again and again, focusing on each action and reaction. Their discussion centered on responsibility and public behavior. They noted how Leo followed his training perfectly even under pressure. His response became an example of discipline and professionalism. The officials agreed that his behavior represented the values they stood for. Meanwhile, Karen sat alone in a waiting room with plain walls and a quiet clock. The ticking sound seemed louder as time passed slowly. She replayed the moment in her mind again and again. She remembered the frustration that pushed her forward and the anger that followed. At the time she felt justified, but now that feeling had faded. In its place was embarrassment and deep regret. Karen thought about how many people had been watching. She thought about the phones raised and the looks on their faces. The weight of public attention pressed on her thoughts. An official entered the room and calmly explained the next steps. His tone was clear and firm and carried no judgment. He spoke about accountability and learning from mistakes. Karen listened closely and nodded slowly as she accepted responsibility. She realized that reacting with anger had only made things worse. Silence from the guard had revealed her own lack of control. Outside, the square continued to function as usual, but the story kept growing. Clips of the incident were shared and discussed widely. People talked about respect, patience, and strength. Some praised Leo for his calm, and others questioned Karen's behavior. Many conversations turned into lessons about self-control. The incident became a topic of reflection rather than conflict. Leo remained unaware of how far the story had traveled. He focused on his duty and maintained his position with care. For him, each day was about service, not attention. A senior guard briefly updated Leo about the wider response. The words were simple and respectful. Leo listened quietly and acknowledged with a slight nod. He felt proud not for himself but for representing the values he believed in. His thoughts returned to his father and the lessons from childhood. Those lessons had guided him through the hardest moment. A young couple approached the gate and paused nearby. They spoke softly about what had happened earlier. Their tone carried respect rather than judgment. Leo stood still as always and did not respond. Yet his presence alone seemed to calm the space around him. The gate felt more than just a boundary now. Karen was later allowed to leave the building under supervision. Her steps were slow and careful as she walked outside. She avoided looking at others and kept her eyes low. As she passed the square, she glanced briefly toward the gate. She saw Leo standing exactly where he had been before. That sight stayed with her deeply. She realized that while her actions were loud, his strength was quiet. That difference stayed clear in her mind. The moment became a turning point for her. Karen promised herself to reflect and change her behavior. She understood that anger had cost her dignity. The lesson was clear and lasting. Back at the gate, Leo continued his duty as the sun began to lower. Shadows stretched across the stone ground. The day moved toward evening quietly. The crowd thinned and the square grew calmer. A peaceful stillness replaced the earlier tension. Leo remained steady as the world moved around him. Officials later documented the incident as a learning example. It became part of training discussions and public awareness. The focus remained on calm response over reaction. Leo finished his shift and walked away with measured steps. He felt tired but fulfilled, knowing he had done what was right. The day had tested him, and he had remained true. Karen went home carrying the weight of reflection. She knew the moment would stay with her for a long time. Change had begun within her quietly. What neither of them knew was that the final outcome was still approaching. The story was not finished yet. The next moment would bring a conclusion that truly shocked everyone. The following morning arrived with clear skies and a quiet calm that felt different from the day before. The city moved at its usual pace, but something unseen had already shifted beneath the surface. The incident at the gate had reached higher levels than anyone expected. Officials gathered in a large meeting room to discuss the matter carefully. They spoke about public conduct and the example shown by calm discipline. Leo's actions were mentioned with respect and admiration. It was decided that the incident would be addressed openly to send a clear message. Not through anger or punishment alone, but through accountability and learning. The goal was to show that respect and control mattered in every situation. Leo arrived for duty later that day, unaware of what had been planned. He stood at his post with the same steady posture and quiet focus. To him, it was another day of service. Karen also woke up that morning carrying heavy thoughts. She had not slept well, and her mind replayed every moment again. The weight of her actions felt heavier with time. She received a message asking her to return to the public office. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. She knew this was the moment she had to face everything fully. At the square, a small group of officials and staff gathered quietly. There were no raised voices or dramatic scenes. The atmosphere was serious and respectful. Karen arrived and stood before the officials and the gate. Leo was present, but remained in position and silent as always. The crowd nearby sensed that something important was about to happen. An official spoke clearly and calmly, addressing the situation openly. He explained what had happened and why it mattered. His words focused on behavior, responsibility, and growth. Karen was invited to speak, and she stepped forward slowly. Her voice was steady but filled with sincerity. She acknowledged her actions without excuses. She spoke about her anger and how it had controlled her. She admitted that silence had revealed her mistake. Her words carried genuine regret. The crowd listened quietly, and no one interrupted. The moment felt heavy but honest. Karen then turned slightly toward Leo. She apologized openly for her behavior and her lack of respect. Her voice did not shake this time. She accepted full responsibility for what she had done. Leo remained silent and still as trained. Yet his calm presence filled the space. The apology landed deeply without a single word spoken. The official thanked Karen for taking responsibility. He spoke about how moments like this could become lessons. The focus stayed on growth rather than shame. The crowd reacted quietly with nods and thoughtful expressions. Phones were lowered and whispers faded. The mood shifted from tension to reflection. Leo was then formally recognized for his professionalism. The acknowledgement was brief and respectful. He accepted it with a small nod, staying true to his nature. The message was clear to everyone watching. Calm strength carried more power than anger. Respect protected dignity for all sides. Karen felt a sense of release she had not expected. Facing the situation openly brought clarity. She understood that change began with accountability. As the gathering ended, people slowly dispersed. The square returned to its normal rhythm. Yet the lesson remained strong in the air. Leo continued his duty without change. He did not seek attention or praise. For him, the day was about service. Karen walked away with a lighter step than before. She knew the moment would guide her future actions. Growth had come from an unexpected place. The story spread further not as a scandal but as an example. People spoke about calm patience and responsibility. The incident became a reminder rather than a conflict. As evening arrived, the sun cast warm light across the square. Leo stood at the gate, steady and silent. The city moved peacefully around him. What shocked everyone was not punishment or drama. It was the power of calm and accountability. In the end, silence spoke louder than anything else. The story closed not with anger but with understanding. Both lives changed quietly in opposite ways. And the lesson remained long after the crowd was gone.